Hi, everyone. Um, okay, so the last week we kind of spent looking at this innate response, the non-specific immune response. Um, so looking at the barriers that stop pathogens getting into our body in the first place, and then once a pathogen has entered the body, what these kind of initial responses are. So we looked at cells that go around and engulf pathogens through phagocytosis. We looked at other molecules like interferons and complement proteins that work to try and rid the body of pathogens. And we looked at a couple of responses, fever and the inflammatory response. We're going to move on now to the adaptive response, or the specific response. And in today's lesson, we're really just going to introduce a few things, so a few of the cells that are involved, and also have a look at the lymphatic system, which is the system that allows certain cells to move around the body for an immune response. So this is just an overview of the cells. Now, just don't freak out and think you need to know all of these cells. You don't. I know this is a little bit blurry, but you might recognize a few things in here. We've got mast cells, which we talked about. We've got macrophages, which are those big eaters, big phagocytes. Erythrocytes are actually just red blood cells. This is just to show different types of blood cells in the body. If we move over to looking at the right here, you'll see there's the natural killer cell, which we looked at in the non-specific response. And then we have these things over here called lymphocytes. So a lymphocyte is basically the white blood cells that reside in the lymph nodes. Okay, and these really are the cells we look at in the specific response. So that's just to show you what a lymphocyte is. So all white blood cells are called leukocytes. Okay, that's all white blood cells. And then there's a type of leukocyte or a type of white blood cell called lymphocyte, and they live in lymph nodes. We're going to cover lymph nodes today. Again, if you remember this from our overview of the immune system, the specific response, we have B cells and T cells. So they are lymphocytes. You do need to know these 4 types of cells, so it's probably good to write this down now. So we have T lymphocytes, which can be helper T cells or helper T lymphocytes. Sometimes you'll see it written as T with a little h, so helper T. And we have cytotoxic T cells, which is sometimes written as TC, cytotoxic T cell. Okay, for today, I just want you to get your head around the names of these cells. We'll look a lot more at them next week. Then we have our B lymphocytes, and they can be plasma B cells or memory B cells. Okay, so just want you to know the names of these because they will come up as we go through this session. Okay, and then just jump into question 1. Okay, we're going to focus mainly on the lymphatic system today. Just note, if you're looking through your textbook, this is section 9E. So it comes in the textbook, it comes after the specific responses. I think it makes more sense to look at it first because it really is the connection between the non-specific and specific immune responses. So the lymphatic system is a one-way circulatory system in our body. It is separate to our blood system, okay? And it consists of 2 different types of tissue. We have primary lymphoid tissue, which is the bone marrow and the thymus. So the thymus is this gland here in the middle of your chest, and bone marrow is found kind of in the hollow sections of all of our long bones in our body. Okay, so it could be in your leg, they could be in your arm. They all have bone marrow on the inside. They are called primary lymphoid tissue. All of our white blood cells originate in bone marrow. So all white blood cells, that could be the things like the mast cells and macrophages and natural killer cells that we've already looked at, they all start in the bone marrow. We're focusing on the lymphocytes, which are our B cells and our T cells. So B lymphocytes, the reason they're called B cells is because they kind of first develop in the bone marrow and then they stay in the bone marrow to mature. Okay, all cells, you might remember from year 11, all cells go through this process of differentiation and kind of maturing into a certain type of cell. B cells do that in the bone marrow, which is why they're called B cells. T cells start in the bone marrow, like all white blood cells do, but then they move to the thymus, and that is where they mature. So the T for thymus is the T for T lymphocyte. Okay, so they all start in the bone marrow, then B lymphocytes stay there, T lymphocytes move on to the thymus to mature. We then have what's called secondary lymphoid tissue, and they are other kind of areas of the body that are involved in the lymphatic system. The main one we're going to talk about are lymph nodes. So if you look over at this diagram, all of these little kind of black circles are lymph nodes. Okay, so they're these little kind of clusters of tissue that are found in certain areas of the body. Now, they are really important because they are where B cells and T cells live. So once they've grown up in either the bone marrow or the thymus, they move to lymph nodes and they congregate there. They sit there until they're needed. Okay, so B cells and T cells don't circulate around the body like our other white blood cells do. They sit in these lymph nodes and basically wait until they're needed. I think a thing to note about lymph nodes is they tend to cluster in certain areas. So there's these clusters in the front of your hips. There are clusters in the armpit. There are clusters at the base of your neck. And you might remember if you've been to the doctor and you've got a cold or a flu or a sore throat, they often feel the sides of your neck. Okay, they'll kind of feel around there to see if there's any swelling. What they're feeling for are those lymph nodes, because if your lymph nodes are swollen, that's an indication that they're working overtime to produce immune cells to fight a pathogen in your body. Okay, so it's a really common sign of illness is swollen lymph nodes. The other secondary lymphoid tissues are the tonsils. If any of you have suffered from tonsillitis, you probably know them well. Some of you might have had your tonsils removed when you were younger. So that's another type of lymphoid tissue. And also the spleen, which is a organ found just in the chest cavity. The flow of lymph through the body is quite unique and important. So lymph itself is the fluid that we're talking about. So if we're talking about our blood circulatory system, blood is obviously the fluid. In the lymphatic system, it is called lymph. And this is a picture here of lymph. You'll see it doesn't look anything like blood. It's very pale because it is mostly full of white blood cells. Okay. It's a fluid that is absorbed from tissues all around the body. Okay, so constantly fluid that is around your body gets absorbed and flowing through the lymph system. The way that lymph drains or flows through the body is quite unique. So you have these tiny, tiny vessels called lymphatic capillaries, and they basically are found between all the tissue in your body, and they absorb this fluid that's just sitting around in your body. I think an important thing to note is this doesn't only happen when you're sick. Your body is constantly draining and flowing all this fluid to check for illness. Okay, so it's not just switched on once you get sick. This is happening all the time. So you've got lymphatic capillaries They pick up the lymph from the tissue around your body. Let's use the example of, say, in your leg. That fluid gets absorbed into lymphatic capillaries. Lots of lymphatic capillaries will kind of merge together. So let's, I'll just go up here. Let's say you've got, this is body tissue. So you've got cells, this is the cells in your leg, and there's all this kind of fluid around there. You'll have all these little capillaries. They will pick up that lymphatic fluid, and then they kind of merge together, and this becomes a lymphatic vessel. Okay, these were the capillaries. Okay, so they merge together to create slightly bigger lymphatic vessels. Lymphatic vessels that travel to lymph nodes are called afferent lymphatic vessels. Okay, if we look at this picture here, this is a lymph node, and you'll see we've got an afferent lymphatic vessel. So let's say this is your leg, and the lymph is being flowed into the lymph nodes through these afferent vessels. Okay, so they'll come through here and go into a lymph node. The vessels that leave the lymph node after the fluid has been kind of checked, which we'll go through in a second, are called efferent lymphatic vessels. So this one here is an efferent lymphatic vessel, and the lymph will leave the lymph node that way. Okay, when fluid leaves lymph nodes, it's been checked, it's been cleared, it gets dropped back into the blood circulation. Okay, so lymph only really travels to lymph nodes. Once it's been checked for pathogens, it then goes back into the blood circulation and gets pumped around your body as blood. Lymph is not pumped by the heart. Okay, it is supported by muscle contraction. So where blood is pumped around the body by the heart, there is no pump in the lymphatic system. The fact that you're moving around and your muscles are moving kind of squeezes this lymph around, which is why if you've ever, it probably wouldn't affect you because you'd be young and healthy and fit, but often like older people, if they're on a plane for say 10 or 15 hours, their legs can get really swollen afterwards. That's because they're not using their muscles, their lymph is not getting drained around the body, so it all kind of sits in one area. And there are valves all the way through lymphatic vessels to stop lymph going back the wrong way. So you can see up here there's a valve. That means that the lymph can't go back the other way. It only goes one way. Okay. Another thing to note is that if we're, say, looking at a bit of tissue here, and so the lymphatic capillaries have picked up that tissue and they're traveling, they will go to the closest lymph nodes. Okay, so if you have an infection in, say, your left leg, it's going to be those lymph nodes in your left groin that deal with that first. Okay, so they just go to the closest place, and then the rest of the fluid will end up going back into the blood circulation. Okay, so just jump back into the quiz and answer questions 3 and 4. Okay, so now we're going to look at this in relation to the immune system. And really, as that link between the second and the third lines of defense. So the main job of the lymphatic system, for our purposes anyway, with looking at immunity, is to screen fluid or to filter fluid. And it's basically looking for pathogens or antigens that are in that fluid. So like I said, your body is constantly checking this lymph all the time. And if there's no pathogens in your body, nothing happens, it gets filtered, it goes back into the blood system. When there is a pathogen in your body, it will kickstart our third line of defense. As we said, the lymph gets absorbed from tissues, goes through the lymphatic vessels into the lymph nodes. And then this is where our lymphocytes come in. So our T cells and B cells live in those nodes, which we talked about. If you look at this picture, there's a T cell zone and a B cell zone. So this would be full of B cells. B cells just sitting there waiting for their moment in the sun. T cells live in this bit. Okay, so they're just sitting there. The lymphocytes, so the T cells and B cells, it's the T cells really initially, they screen the lymph that is coming in. So let's say we've got the fluid coming in through these afferent vessels. It will that fluid will get squished all the way through the lymph node. It gets moved around, and so it needs to pass all those T cells and B cells that are sitting there. Okay. If there's no infection, the fluid will just drain out and will go back into the blood system. When we say they're screening, what they're looking for is either pathogens. So let's say there's actually a virus or a bacteria particle that has been picked up in that lymph and has gone in here. If that has happened, these cells will know about it. The other thing they're looking for are these antigen presenting cells that we looked at last week. Those cells that save a bit of an antigen, if they come through here with that antigen, these cells will know about it. We'll do a bit more on that in the next slide. And if pathogens or antigens are detected, the adaptive immune response is launched. Okay, so we don't get these B cells and T cells activated unless they need to be because they've identified a pathogen. Like I said, we'll look at the antigen presentation again. So hopefully you remember from last week. Macrophages, and also another type of cell called dendritic cells, are antigen presenting cells. They, at the site of infection, so let's say in the leg, someone's been stabbed in the leg and a lot of bacteria has gotten in. The antigen presenting cells will phagocytose the pathogen, and then they save a piece of the antigen and display it on their MHC2 markers. Okay, we looked at this picture last time. This is a macrophage. It's engulfed a pathogen, gotten rid of it, which is great, but it's actually saved a bit of antigen on the MHC2 marker. Okay, that macrophage now will travel to the lymph nodes. Okay, and there it will present that antigen, the antigen that's on its surface. So let's say we're down in the leg here. That's the stab wound. The macrophage there had engulfed the bit of bacteria. It saved some of that antigen. That macrophage now has traveled up here through the lymphatic system to a lymph node, which is what we can see here. We've got our lymph node. When a helper T cell that has a specific receptor for that antigen, remember this is our specific response, if there's a helper T cell with a specific receptor, it will bind with that antigen. Okay, so this was our cell that traveled to the lymph node. This is all going on somewhere in here. We'll look at this again in the next slide. This helper T cell receptor has bound with that specific antigen. And when that happens, this helper T cell will start replicating. Okay, you'll have two, and then it'll keep replicating. So this helper T cell that's going to fight this specific infection has started making heaps of copies of itself. Okay, have a go at question 5, and then come back in and we'll kind of look at that again in a slightly different way. Okay, so we've got the lymph node. This is just a closer in picture. Remember, we have our T cells in this T cell zone. So this here is a close-up of a T cell. It has a T cell receptor. This is a TH, a helper T cell. Okay, we have our macrophage. This is our antigen presenting cell, has physically traveled in the lymph to the lymph node. It ends up here. Okay, so this antigen presenting cell with its antigen has found this T cell, which happens to have the perfect receptor for that antigen. And they will bind together, and that will stimulate that helper T cell to start replicating itself. Okay, it is specific. If this, let's say this antigen is for tetanus, and this T cell has whooping cough receptors, and this T cell has chlamydia receptors. They're not going to bind with that antigen. It has to find the right T cell that also has that tetanus receptor, and they will bind. Okay, it is a fascinating system. Really, we should be all dead. It's bonkers that this actually happens, but it does. Okay, so it is specific. They will bind together, and that initiates the third line of defense. That's when we say that the adaptive immune response has started because a helper T cell has bound with specific antigen on that antigen presenting cell. Okay, so just go in and answer question 6.